In this video, we're going to talk about what domain and range is. So domain is all values of x that are in your graph or in your points in your relation. It's just all values of x. And range is all y values. So if we're going to list the domain for this function, well, it's not a function because we checked and it's not, for this relation, then we're going to list each of the x numbers, and we already have them listed in order here, so you actually have to use this bracket when you're listing. So we're going to put -3, -2, 1, and 4. So this bracket that's hard to draw, that is when you're making a list of numbers. So on your paper, in your notes paper, you probably want to have that written down somewhere. So we're going to also do the same thing with the range, -4, -2, 0, 3, and 5. So that means that we're just including those points. We're not including in between -2 and -1 and +1. We're not going to include 0. So this means that we're just listing each number on its own. So you have to use the list bracket. That's important. So let's try another one. In this one, we're not given separate points. So we want all the x values, we want all the y values. Domain is x, range is y. So we're going to come across from the left, and the first number that we hit as we come across from the left would be this number here, which is in between -2 and -4, so that's -3. So I'm going to put -3. I'm going to keep going across, and the biggest number I hit as I come across is this number here, which is 3. It's in between 2 and 4, so I put (3). Because I want to include those two numbers, the -3 and 3, I'm going to draw this bracket. This is to include, and it includes the two numbers we just wrote, but it also includes everything in between. And so we're going to put those brackets on, the -3 and 3. So this not only means that the two numbers we write are solutions, but we also include all numbers in between those two numbers. So then we want the range. So we want small to big. So we're going to come up from the bottom of the board, and the first number that we hit, so I'm going to change color for a minute. The first number we hit, oops, that didn't work. When we come up from the bottom of the board here, let's see, that's -2, -3, that's a -4, even though you can't really see it anymore. So I'm going to put -4, and as we climb up, the highest point right here in between 2 and 4 is 3. So again, we want to include everything in between, and we want to include -4 and 3. And so we draw the square bracket. All right, on this one, we're going to start with the x, the domain, and we're going to come across the board, and the first number we hit, even though it's an open circle, so I kind of jumped over it. It's in between -3 and -5, that's -4. And notice that it's open. Remember, an open circle, when we draw an open circle, that means we do not want to include that point. It is not a solution. So that point is not a solution. We need to show that in the domain. So if we drew these brackets, that would say that it is a solution. But we want to say that it's not. So the way that we would say that is we would draw in a parentheses. So this means that it's an open circle. Therefore, it is not a solution. Okay, so we're going to draw an open parentheses around -4 to say that's not a solution. So then we keep going, and the last place we hit is here, but there's an arrow. Arrow means that, oh, it's going to keep going. Therefore, if it's going to keep going, then it's going to go forever. That's going to go to infinity. So here we put the infinity sign. Anytime we do the infinity sign, we're always going to have parentheses. So we're going to put parentheses around the infinity sign. The range, we're going to come from the bottom of the paper for the range. So you come up from the bottom. The first number we hit right here is 1, because it's in between, it's right after 0, just 1 square up. And we do want to include that because there's a line and there's points. So to show that we include the 1, remember including are those brackets. So we're going to include the 1 and draw those brackets. And we're going to keep heading up. Notice that this point is a high point, but there's also an arrow that's headed up. And so in this case, we got to go for the one that keeps going on and on forever. And so this is going to go to infinity, and we draw the parentheses around that. Okay, domain and range, x and y, we come across from the left. For our domain, the first number we hit from the left is -2. So we list -2 and we close it, because when I say close, I mean it is a solution. If I say open, I'm talking about not a solution. This would be open. So here we include -2. We come across, the biggest number we hit is a +2. So comma +2. We include everything in between, and we say we want to include 2. It's not open. Okay, so range, we come up from the bottom of the paper. The first number we hit happens to be 0. We include 0, so we draw closed, and we come up, up, up. The highest number we hit is 4, and we close the 4 to show that that is a solution. Domain and range again, x and y. The x values, as you come across, the first that we hit is an arrow. And so when we hit that arrow, that means that we're going to be, so we're dealing with x's, we come across, we hit an arrow. That arrow is actually going to keep going, and it's going to head towards smaller and smaller numbers. Notice these are negatives. It's going to keep getting more and more negative as it comes down and across. So it's headed towards the left, and so it's going to actually head towards -infinity as it keeps going that direction. So we come across, and here's what we hit again. We hit an arrow that's going to keep heading out in the right direction, also upwards, but also right. So these numbers are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is going to be +infinity. And then we're going to do the range. So we come up from the bottom. Notice when we come from the bottom, we also hit an arrow. And that arrow heads down, 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 down into the negatives. So -infinity forever. And then up, 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 up. The top thing we hit is an arrow. And so that's going to keep headed up, up, up. And that's going to head towards positive numbers forever and ever. So positive infinity. Okay, domain and range. So x, I'm going to always start with x and come across from the left. So the first thing I hit as I come across is an arrow. That arrow is going to keep going, and it's going to head towards more and more negatives as it heads left and up. I come across, the last thing I hit as I come across is another arrow. And so I'm going to head this time, it's going to head towards positive infinity. The range, come up from the bottom. From the bottom, the first thing that we hit is not an arrow. It is a point. -4 and -6, in between that's -5. So we hit -5, and because it's a closed point, we are going to draw this bracket around the -5. Comma, if you come up, 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 the last thing we hit are arrows. Anytime we hit an arrow, we know it's going to go on forever, and in this case, it's going to head up. Those arrows are headed up and over, but since it's also headed upwards, it's going to be on the range heading towards also infinity. Okay, domain and range, we're coming across from the left. Domain, the first thing I hit here as I come across is 0. And we want to include 0, so we draw a closed box. As we come across, the last thing we hit are arrows. So we know it's going to head out this direction and get more and more and more and more and more. That's infinity. We're going to come up from the bottom for the range. We come up from the bottom. First thing we hit is an arrow. That arrow is not only going to the left, but it's also headed down. And it's headed towards negative infinity. And we head up, up, up. Last thing we headed up is also an arrow. If you keep going, going, going with that arrow, it's not only headed to the right, but it's also headed up. So positive infinity. Okay, this one, we're coming from the left, x, y. First thing we hit as we come across is an arrow. That arrow is headed towards negative infinity. Negative numbers. We come across to the right, we have an arrow headed towards positive infinity. So the range, we come up from the bottom. And this one's kind of tricky, but we come up from the bottom, and the first thing we hit is the number 1. So we write the number 1. We want to include it, so draw your box. And then the last thing we hit is a 3. Notice that we didn't hit anything in between the 3 and the 1. There's no graph in between those two. There's nothing in between. So we want to show that. Oh, we do want to show that. So I messed up on the brackets to show that I'm making a list this time, and I don't want to include between. Remember the list bracket. This does not include in between. It just lists the numbers. We would draw this bracket around those numbers. And the last one you have, okay, we're going to come across from the left, domain and range. We come across from the left. First thing we hit is an arrow, so we know that's going to be negative infinity, comma. If you notice, there's a hole, and we got to say somehow that there is a hole and it doesn't include -3. So to show that, we're going to put comma -3, leave it open. We're going to put -3 again. So that shows that there's a hole at -3 because we stopped We drew an open parentheses, and now we're going to keep going. As we keep